In the early 1800s, the conflict of lack of women's suffrage in America began to arise among the larger population. Women's voting rights were not equal to the suffrage rights of men. After multiple hardships, letters, protests, and petitions, women were finally granted the compromise of equal representation in government on August 18, 1920. This, however, came with a cost. Not only women, but also men worked hard for such a rewarding compromise. They also worked a large amount of time. Starting in 1848, when the first Women's Rights Convention was held, many were then convinced it was time to put their goals into action. Such activists include Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, Frederick Douglass, and Lucretia Mott. Susan Brownell Anthony, more suitably recognized as Susan B. Anthony, assisted in the accomplishment of passing a once-thought impossible amendment. Born in Adams, Massachusetts on February 15, 1820, Anthony was brought up in a family of inspired activists, which in turn caused her to feel responsible for carrying on the legacy. After many years of fighting for her rights, Anthony was arrested in Rochester, New York due to illegally voting. Her home in Rochester has since been made into a museum for the public in honor of her works. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born on November 12, 1815, and had taken much influence from her father, Daniel Cady, a U.S. congressman. Through her father, Stanton had learned about women being deprived of many privileges, and in her late years, she decided to take action. Stanton and Anthony crossed paths in their lifetimes and joined visions in order to create the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. Through this suffrage group, Stanton and Anthony were able to raise awareness to other women about the conflict of women's lack of voting rights. Influenced by this group was Lucy Stone, a suffragist born in Massachusetts on August 13, 1818. Raised in a very involved family, Stone naturally became involved in her society at a young age. Being strong-willed, Stone did not let anything come in the way of her beliefs. She took part in creating the American Women's Suffrage Association, which, like the National Women's Suffrage Association, gained recognition towards the lack of women's voting rights in America. Together, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone worked to combine the two groups to then become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, better known as NAWSA, in 1890. As a leader in the association, Stone, determined to inspire, spoke the words, "If the law can meddle with the woman, why should not the woman meddle with the law?" With similar words spoke Alice Paul, as she once said, "When you put your hand to the plow, you can't put it down until you get to the end of the row." Paul spoke many more inspiring words during the time she participated in the National Women's Party, an organization created like many others to support protests on the conflict of women being deprived of suffrage rights in America. Alice Paul had led many women from the National American Women's Suffrage Association to join her and Lucy Burns in the National Women's Party. Lucy Burns was born in 1879 in Brooklyn, New York. Burns originally started studies at Oxford University, but later discovered her true passion towards fighting for what is right and participated in the British suffrage movement. She implemented her knowledge from being the British movement onto protests for American women's suffrage. Burns, as Alice Paul described, was extremely courageous, 1,000 times more courageous than I was. Not only were women extremely courageous, but also men, one of which included Frederick Douglass, a man born into slavery with strong support on behalf of women's suffrage. He believed that right is of no sex, truth is of no color. Douglass was so passionate about granting women the right of suffrage that he had attended multiple rights conventions, including the first Women's Rights Convention. Lucretia Mott was part of the National Women's Suffrage Association and was born in Nantucket, Massachusetts, to a Quaker family on January 3, 1793. According to the Library of Congress, Mott was inspired by a father who encouraged his daughters to be useful and a mother who was active in business affairs. Lucretia Mott worked as a tireless advocate for the oppressed while also raising 6 children. Throughout her life, Mott took part in many reform movements, including the 1848 Women's Rights Convention. Mott was a crucial piece of America's women's suffrage movement. Throughout the 1900s, protests on women's voting rights in America became more and more popular. One of the major protests that marked a turning point of hope for Americans was the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade.
The 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade and the one in Boston in 1914 had a big impact on the government's and the public's view on women's suffrage. It really put the issue center front into people's minds.
This protest brought widespread confidence in the compromise of an amendment for women to vote because the parade had been held one day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. The inauguration had brought tens of thousands of spectators to Washington, D.C., which had in turn increased the number of those who would view the parade. Unfortunately, the parade had aroused conflict to protesters. Although it increased awareness to supporting women's suffrage, many viewers assaulted the people in this parade. The mistreatment of the marchers amplified the event and the cause into a major news story and led to congressional hearings, where the D.C. Superintendent of Police lost his job. Although many had been hospitalized during the parade, the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade did have some positive outcomes. After being broadcasted to a substantial amount of people, many had become positively influenced in supporting suffrage rights for women. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, Frederick Douglass, and Lucretia Mott were not the only activists who devoted their lives to achieving the suffrage goal, but their journey through suffrage and sacrifice proved to be a journey well traveled. The journey of more than 50 years has left a great impact on society today.
Women encountered many conflicts in order to get the right to vote. It took 72 years for the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Women worked very hard. They were supported by some men, but some men and also some women were opposed. The men were in power since they were the only ones who could vote. Women were asking men to give up their power. People are always reluctant to give up power. Also, many felt that women should be in the home and that it was not appropriate for women to be involved in politics. Some even felt women were not intelligent enough to vote. So there were many conflicts that the women encountered.
Every woman and every man who had sacrificed, suffered, protested, and even died for their goal are able to peacefully rest, knowing that as of August 18, 1920, women were able to exercise their right given by the 19th Amendment, the right for people of all sex to vote.